His hands were cracked at the knuckles. Black grease in the lines of his palms that no washing could lift, because he had not washed properly in 3 weeks. The cigarette between his fingers had burned almost to the skin, and he had not noticed. He stood at the edge of berth 214 in the port of Antwerp, looking at a crane he had personally inspected at 4 in the morning, and he was waiting for a ship he had stopped believing in. Hugues Colson was 31 years old. The men who knew his real name could be counted on the fingers of one hand. To everyone else in the docks he was just Harry. Code name. A sea captain by training, a harbor employee by cover, a resistance commander by conviction, and on this particular Tuesday morning, the 28th of November 1944, he held in his coat pocket a piece of paper that listed 18 ships, 10,000 tons of supplies, and a single sentence in English that he had read so many times the ink had begun to smear. First Allied convoy. Empire Duke leading. Estimated arrival, 1100 hours. He looked at his wristwatch. It was 10:52. 85 days. That was what stood between this moment and the morning the Germans had tried to set fire to his port. 85 days of patrolling docks in civilian clothes, with a Mauser hidden under his jacket. 85 days of burying men whose names he had memorized so he could write to their mothers in his own hand. And in the next 8 minutes, if the ship rounded the bend of the Scheldt and reached his berth, every gallon of fuel that would carry the Allied armies into Germany was going to come through the gates he had refused to let burn. If you appreciate untold stories like this one, the men history almost forgot, please subscribe to WW2 Decoded, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which forgotten figure of the war you'd like us to cover next. This channel exists because of you, and Hugues Colson's story exists because someone, 80 years on, decided he was worth remembering. To understand the man standing on berth 214, you have to go back to a morning in 1943, in a quiet Antwerp office above a chandlery on the St. Andriesplatz. A Belgian officer named Urban Reniers, working for the underground secret army, sat across from Hugues Colson and said only one sentence: "We need someone who knows the port better than the Germans do." Colson, who had spent half his adult life walking those quays, answered with a question. "How many men can I have?" Reniers told him the truth. "Whoever you can trust. And no one else." 600. That was the number Colson eventually settled on. 600 dockworkers, crane operators, lock keepers, tugboat hands and warehouse foremen, chosen one at a time, over the course of a year, with the patience of a man building a clock. He never recruited 2 men from the same family. He never recruited anyone who drank. He never wrote anything down. The Germans walked past him every morning at the dockgate and saluted him as a useful collaborator, and he saluted back, and went to work, and at lunchtime he sat in a small cafe on the Vlaamse and drew imaginary lines on a paper napkin, marking the 247 specific points where the Germans were going to place their demolition charges when the day came. He knew it was coming. They all knew. By the summer of 1944 the Allies were across France. The Germans had a doctrine for retreating ports. They had practiced it at Cherbourg, at Brest, at Le Havre. Reduce the harbor to scrap, blow the cranes, sink ships in the channels, burn the dry docks, flood the locks. Make sure the enemy gains a name on a map and nothing else. And Antwerp was not a name on a map. Antwerp was the largest port in northern Europe. 699 hectares of basins, 592 cranes, 45 kilometers of quays. It could move 40,000 tons of supplies a day if it was working. 0 if it was not. Every Allied general from Eisenhower down knew that whoever held Antwerp held the war. The Germans planned to leave them nothing. Colson planned to leave the Germans nothing to destroy. On the morning of the 4th of September, 1944, a sound carried across the rooftops of Antwerp that Colson had not heard since May 1940. Tank engines. British tank engines. The 11th Armored Division, racing north from the Seine, had covered a distance no one believed possible, and they were inside the city by lunchtime. Colson did not celebrate. He gave one order: to the bridges, to the locks. Now. His men moved in groups of 6 and 8, in workmen's overalls, carrying tools that hid pistols and grenades. They knew the docks the way a pianist knows a keyboard. By dusk that day, Coulson's resistance fighters held the Gronendahl-Lahn Bridge over the Albat Canal, the last crossing the Germans needed to retreat through Merksem. They held the Cruischanz Lock, which controlled the water level of half the port. They held the number 12 Sluiskens Lock, 2 kilometers further north along the Scheldt, where a single turn of a wheel could flood the entire harbor basin. They held the Merksem Hydro Station, which powered every crane on the eastern side. By midnight, on the 4th of September, 600 Belgian dockworkers had captured 40 square kilometers of harbor, the largest urban industrial complex in continental Europe, and they had done it without losing a man. Coulson went to the British command post that night. He found a major sitting on the running board of a jeep, eating a tin of stew with a bayonet. Coulson tried, in his limited English, to explain what his men had taken. The major nodded, said something polite, and returned to his stew. Coulson walked back to his command post, a small office above a chandlery on the Vlaamse Kaai, the same office where Reniers had recruited him a year before, and he sat down at the desk, and he waited for the Allies to come and consolidate what he had just handed them. They did not come. 2 days later, on the 6th of September, the British 11th Armoured Division was ordered south to join the operation that would later become known as Market Garden. The tanks rolled out of Antwerp the way they had rolled in, quickly, cheerfully, waving. Coulson stood on the Quai van Dyck and watched the last Sherman turn the corner at the Steenplein. He pulled a small notebook out of his coat pocket. He wrote one line in French. He underlined it twice. Seul, maintenant. Alone, now. For 13 days, 600 Belgian civilians held the largest port in Europe against the German 15th Army. I've read Coulson's account of those 13 days 3 times, and what strikes me is not the heroism, it's the loneliness. He kept expecting reinforcement. Every morning he woke up, wherever he had collapsed for 2 hours, and he listened for tank engines from the south. They never came. And what he wrote, years later in his memoir, was not bitter. It was sad. He wrote, "They came. They waved. They left. We stayed." 6 words. That sentence contains, I think, the whole truth of how generals win wars and ordinary men pay for them. On the morning of the 8th of September, just after 4 o'clock, a runner reached him at the Cruischanz Lock. The boy was 16, the son of a tugboat captain Coulson had recruited the previous spring. He could barely speak. He had run 2 kilometers across the docks in the dark. "Sir," he said. "Sir." "The hydro station." Coulson asked him only one question. "How many?" The boy said, "All of them." 21 men. The Wehrmacht had counterattacked Merksem in force, retaken the power station, killed every defender. Coulson did not shout. He did not curse. He sat down on a wooden crate, and he lit a cigarette, and he stared at the lock gate for a long time without speaking. Then he stood up and said, "We hold the rest." And he walked back to his post. That was the moment, he later said, that broke him and remade him in the same instant. Until that morning he had thought of the docks as machinery. After that morning he understood that machinery was the only thing that justified the burying of men. He stopped sleeping in one place. He moved every 6 hours. He carried a different jacket in each command post, so the Germans, if they captured him, would not recognize him by his clothing. He sent his wife a letter saying he was working a long shift and would be home soon. And then he did not write to her again for 11 weeks. A German engineer was captured on the 12th of September near the Albat dock. In the inside pocket of his coat, soaked from a fall into a basin, was a folded schematic of the entire Antwerp port. 247 red marks. Coulson sat by candlelight in the chandlery office and counted them one by one. He had thought the figure was around 200. It was higher than he had imagined. The Germans had planned to demolish 247 separate strategic points. His 600 men had stopped that. Not the British armor. Not the Canadian infantry. 600 men with revolvers and wrenches. The Canadians arrived in force in the last week of September. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Rileys, under Lieutenant Colonel Denier Whittaker, a tall, lean Canadian, with a habit of speaking very quietly, and a distinguished service order pinned to his battle dress. Whittaker came to find Coulson on a wet evening at the Cruchans Lock. He had been told to expect a Belgian officer. What he found was a thin man in a workman's coat, unshaven, eyes hollow, sitting on an upturned bucket, with a Mauser across his knees. "Colonel Coulson?" Whittaker asked. The man on the bucket looked up. "Harry," Coulson said. "Just Harry." Whittaker offered him a cigarette. Coulson took it. Whittaker later wrote in his diary that night he looked like a clerk and fought like a regiment. "I have never met a man so tired who refused so completely to sit down." They became friends, real friends, the kind of friendship that only happens between men who have both already done something they cannot describe to anyone who was not there. Whittaker assigned a liaison officer, Lieutenant Carl Six, who crossed enemy lines almost nightly to bring Coulson intelligence, and to take back his maps of the docks, maps drawn from memory, accurate to the meter, of every quay, every shed, every drainage pipe. But by the first week of October, Coulson realized something terrible. Something his men were not yet allowed to say out loud. The port was saved. The cranes worked. The dry docks were intact. The lock gates held water. And it did not matter. Because 80 kilometers downstream, the Scheldt River, the only waterway that connected Antwerp to the sea, was still German-held. The estuary, with its islands of Walcheren and South Beveland, bristled with coastal artillery and was sown with thousands of naval mines. No Allied ship could reach the docks Coulson had saved. Antwerp, in that autumn of 1944, was a heart with no veins. He said exactly that, in English, to Whittaker. "We saved a heart with no veins." Whittaker did not answer. There was nothing to say. The clearing of the Scheldt would take the Canadian First Army 85 days of fighting in flooded polders, against an enemy who had nothing left but defiance. 10,000 Canadian, British, and Polish soldiers would be killed or wounded in those marshes. And Coulson, who had held a port no one could yet use, would spend those weeks doing the most painful work of his war, waiting. I've thought about that period a lot, and here is what I cannot get past. Every history of the Western Front in late 1944 talks about the fuel crisis. The Red Ball Express, Patton's tanks running dry, Eisenhower's anguished letters, Montgomery's bridge too far. And all of those crises, every single one, were because the Allies had taken the port at Antwerp on the 4th of September and could not use it until the 28th of November. 85 days. The exact length of time Coulson stood guard over a harbor the world had forgotten it owned. The fuel crisis was not a strategic failure. It was a calendar. The Royal Navy began sweeping the Scheldt on the 1st of November. Bangor-class minesweepers, Bootle among them, working in line abreast across a river estuary 30 kilometers wide. They swept 229 ground mines, magnetic and acoustic, and 38 contact mines. 27 days of work. 1 ship lost. 2 damaged. On the 14th of November, Coulson was invited to a briefing at the Allied Naval Headquarters in the city. He sat at the back of the room in his civilian coat. He still did not own a uniform, and watched a British commander point to a chart. 267 mines cleared. The river would be declared open in 12 days. The first convoy could sail on the 28th. Coulson stood up and walked to the chart. He laid his own map over it, drawn by hand on graph paper, of the inner harbor. He showed where the Empire Duke could safely berth. Which crane would unload her first? Which warehouse would store the contents? The commander stared at him. "You've worked this out already?" Coulson did not smile. "I've worked this out since 1943. The morning of November 28th was cold and grey. There was a fine mist over the river that did not lift. 7,000 dockworkers had been told the day before to assemble at the gates at 0700. No one had been told why. No one needed to be. By 6 in the morning, the entrance to the docks was a quiet crowd of men in working clothes, carrying tools wrapped in oilcloth. They had not been paid in months. Most of them had not eaten properly in weeks. They came anyway. Coulson stood at berth 214. He had not slept. His coat was buttoned wrong. The cigarette had burned to his fingers. At 10 minutes past 11, the first masts appeared at the bend in the river. Empire Duke, leading 17 other ships. 10,000 tons of supplies. Tanks, shells, rations, boots, penicillin, petrol. The sound of her engines reached him before he saw her hull. A low diesel rumble he had not heard in a port since 1940. She slid past him. The naval officer on her bridge saw the thin man in the civilian coat, standing alone on the quay, and raised a hand in salute. Coulson did not salute back. He could not lift his arm. He was crying. Behind him, without any order being given, 7,000 Belgian dockworkers began to walk down the quays toward the ships. By noon, the first crane had swung its first load, a wooden crate of American artillery shells, onto the cobbles of Antwerp. By that evening, 10,000 tons of war had come ashore. 18 days later, on the 16th of December, in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, 170 miles away, German tanks attacked through the American lines, and the Battle of the Bulge began. Every gallon of fuel that drove every Sherman tank that drove the Germans back across the Meuse, every shell that the American gunners fired at Bastogne, came through Hugues Coulson's port. And the Germans knew it. That was when the rockets came. The first V2 had already fallen on Antwerp on the 7th of October. But after the port opened, the rate of attacks rose to something the city had never imagined. 4,248 V1 flying bombs would eventually fall in the vicinity of Antwerp. More than 1,700 V2 ballistic missiles. The dockworkers gave the port a new name, in the same flat workman's slang they used for everything else. They called it the City of Sudden Death. 90% of all glass in the port installations was eventually shattered. Plywood replaced windows. The workers wore tin helmets to load grain. On the 16th of December, while the Bulge battle was beginning 200 kilometers east, a single V2 struck the Cinema Rex in central Antwerp during an afternoon screening and killed 567 people in one strike. Coulson was at the docks when he heard the blast. He thought for a moment that the harbor was finally gone. When he learned what the rocket had hit, he sat down on a coil of rope and did not stand for an hour. I want to pause here, because there is something about that day that has stayed with me. December 16th, 1944. On one map, in the Ardennes, German tanks were rolling forward through the snow, and 250,000 American soldiers were fighting for their lives. On another map, in Antwerp, a Belgian harbor master was sitting on a coil of rope, because a rocket had killed an audience watching a film. The two events were not separate. They were the same war. The same German army. The same calculation. Burn the port. Bleed the front. Coulson understood that in his bones. And the dockworkers, who never read newspapers, understood it too. So they kept unloading. They kept working through the rocket alerts. They kept walking to the gates every morning. 2.5 million tons of supplies moved through Antwerp between November 28th and the German surrender in May 1945. 2.5 million tons. Almost all of it unloaded by men who had to dive for cover, on average, several times every shift. This is the part of the war that is never in the photographs. In January, Coulson was officially commissioned. He was given the rank of lieutenant colonel. He was decorated by the King of the Belgians, by the British, by the Canadians. Dennis Whittaker, his Canadian friend, pinned the British decoration on him personally and said only one sentence. "About time, Harry." Coulson, who had not laughed in a long time, laughed once. He survived the war. He went back to being a sea captain. He lived a long, quiet life in the city he had defended, in the same neighborhoods, walking past the same quays, telling the story only when his friends from the resistance gathered, and even then sparingly. He gave one major interview, in 1972, to the local paper Gazette van Antwerpen. The reporter asked him what he had been thinking when the Empire Duke rounded the bend in the river that morning in November of '44. Coulson considered the question. He took a long time to answer. And then he said, "People speak of generals. I speak of the man with the wrench." The wrench, in his answer, was not a metaphor. There had been an actual man with a wrench, a dockworker named Franz, whose surname Coulson did not remember, and never tried to recover, who had spent the night of September the 5th, 1944, slowly unscrewing the detonator from a German charge wired to the base of a 40-ton crane at the Albert dock. He had done it by feel, in total darkness, while a German sentry walked past him twice. Coulson knew his face. He did not know his name. He never saw him after the war. That, to Coulson, was the truth of Antwerp, not the generals. Not even Coulson himself. The man with the wrench. Multiplied by 600. Multiplied by 7,000. Coulson died in Antwerp in the year 2000, 87 years old, in a small apartment within walking distance of the docks. His memoirs had been transcribed 3 years earlier by the historian Frank Stapert, under the title Colonel Harry. In the last chapter of that book there is a sentence that I think every viewer of this video should hear, because it sums up something the official histories of the Second World War have never quite managed to capture. He wrote, "The port opened because men no one will ever name refused to go home." I have read those words many times, and I have never been able to improve on them. If you have come this far with us, through Coulson's 85 days, and the 18 ships, and the city of sudden death, please take 1 second now to subscribe to WW2 Decoded. Leave a like, and drop a comment with the name of someone in your own family who served, who built, who unloaded, who waited. Their names belong to this story too. We read every comment. And on this channel we believe that remembering is the second job of every generation. Here is the final fact. On the night of the 4th of September 1944, when Eugen Coulson and his 600 dockworkers seized the port of Antwerp from the Germans, they did not lose a single man. 3 weeks later, holding it alone after the British armour had left, they had buried 87 of their own, and 114 lay wounded. By the time the war ended in May of 1945, more than 2,000 civilians in the city of Antwerp had been killed by German rockets, aimed at the port they had saved. And yet, through the 90% shattered glass, and the plywood windows, and the constant scream of incoming V1s, and the silent terror of the V2s that arrived without warning, the dockworkers walked to the gates every morning, and they unloaded the ships. And they did not stop. The Germans, in their post-war interrogations, were asked again and again how they had lost the port. They could not understand it. They had planned the demolition for 2 years. They had marked 247 charges on detailed schematics. They had a doctrine, and an army, and the time to use both. And they were beaten by a sea captain in a workman's coat, and 600 men who knew, in their bones, every inch of 40 square kilometers of dock. That is the story of how the war was won. Not in the headquarters, not on the maps, on the quay. At berth 214. At 11:17 in the morning, on the 28th of November, 1944. By a man whose hands were cracked at the knuckles, and who did not return the salute, because he could not lift his arm.